Sophie Gardner was a girl who had always been fighting. A long day with 3 classes followed by an exhausting shift at Brood Awakening. The local coffee shop that helped pay half of her rent left Sophie drained. She felt like she was living in an endless cycle with no way out. How long had it been since she had time to rest? To dream? Winter was approaching, but she couldn't even afford a proper coat. That evening, after a tiring day, Sophie stepped onto the number 42 bus. Relieved to see it had arrived on time, she pulled out her monthly pass and handed it to the driver without saying a word. Then, she sat down in the seat at the back, resting her head against the cold window, watching the city outside blur in the night. Honestly, Sophie just wanted to end a long, exhausting day and rest, not thinking about anything except surviving until tomorrow. But no one knew that this bus ride that night would be the turning point that changed her life. As the bus was about to leave the stop, a voice suddenly called out, "Wait a moment." The doors opened, and a young man rushed onto the bus. He looked to be in his early 20s, dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans. But there was something about him that felt different. A certain confidence, perhaps, and something subtle that made people take notice. The driver reluctantly opened the doors and the young man quickly boarded. Slightly out of breath, 350, please, the driver said flatly, and the young man started to fumble for his wallet. But then his face shifted to one of panic as he patted his pockets and then stopped. "I'm sorry, I think I left my wallet in my other jacket," he said, his voice trailing off. Sophie noticed his look of embarrassment. It was a look she had worn many times herself, especially when she had forgotten to bring enough money. Without thinking, she stood up and walked toward the front of the bus. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the loose change she had received from tips earlier and walked forward. "I've got it," she said, extending her hand. The young man looked up, surprised, but after a moment of hesitation, he took the money. "Thank you, I'll pay you back somehow," he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. Sophie smiled tiredly. "Don't worry about it," she replied, then returned to her seat. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't even notice that his gaze lingered on her for a moment before he sat down a few rows ahead, his eyes occasionally glancing back at her. What Sophie didn't know was that the man she had just helped was none other than Ethan Carter, heir to one of the largest hotel empires in the world. Carter Grand Hotels, a name Sophie would never have associated with this man. He was someone Sophie would never have imagined would step into her life in this way. The next day, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the young man from the bus. She didn't know why she kept thinking about him. After all, he was just another stranger. But something about him stayed with her. Maybe it was the gratitude in his eyes, or the way he seemed so genuine despite his situation. She thought she would never see him again. But fate had other plans. A week later, Ethan walked into Brood Awakening. Sophie had just started her shift when she saw him walk through the door. Looking exactly like the day they had met on the bus. He smiled when their eyes met, and Sophie blinked in surprise. "It's you," she said, before she could stop herself. "I told you I'd pay you back," Ethan replied with a playful grin. Sophie couldn't help but laugh. But it was clear he was serious. He ordered a coffee and, to her surprise, sat at a table by the window instead of leaving right away. Sophie couldn't focus as much as she wanted to. She found herself glancing at him, wondering why he was there and what he wanted. The following mornings were no different. Ethan showed up every day, ordering coffee, sitting quietly with a book, and stealing occasional glances at Sophie. She noticed that there was something oddly refreshing about him. He wasn't glued to his phone or chatting with anyone. In a world obsessed with distractions, Ethan seemed like a rare example of someone who was truly present. As the days passed, their interactions became more natural. They talked more, shared small stories about their lives, and Sophie began to open up. He made her feel heard in a way no one had for years. Sophie started to look forward to his visits, even if just for the brief moments they spent talking. But there was a problem Sophie couldn't ignore. Ethan wasn't who he said he was. She didn't know it yet, but the truth was coming, and it would change everything. One evening, after their usual coffee, Ethan hesitated. "I need to tell you something," he began, his tone suddenly serious. Sophie looked up, sensing a shift. He paused, his fingers tightening around his cup before finally admitting, "I'm not who you think I am." Sophie's heart raced as she braced herself for what was about to come next. Who was he, and what was he hiding? Ethan looked quietly into Sophie's eyes, no longer holding back. "I'm not just some guy working a corporate job," he said. "I didn't tell you the truth. I've been hiding who I really am. Sophie blinked, trying to process his words. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaky despite her best efforts to stay calm. Ethan paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. My family, they own Carter Grand Hotels. The hotels you see everywhere. The empire. That's who I am. Sophie stared at him, struggling to comprehend the information. Carter Grand Hotels. The name sounded so familiar. She'd seen the billboards, read about them in the business section of newspapers. But it didn't make sense. The Ethan she had come to know didn't seem like someone who would fit into that world. He was kind, humble, and, despite his polished appearance, unlike any rich businessman she had ever met. The image she had built of him began to crumble, piece by piece. She stared at him, her mind clouded with confusion. But you said you were just a regular guy. You said you didn't want to be part of your family's business. You said you were starting over. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I left the business. I wanted to live differently. I wanted to experience life as someone who wasn't defined by their wealth. But I didn't know how to tell you the truth. Every day I spent with you, I was terrified of losing the only real connection I'd ever had. Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. The warmth she had once felt toward him was slowly being replaced by a mixture of betrayal and confusion. How could he have hidden this from her? For weeks, they had shared stories, laughed together, and built something that felt genuine. And yet, all of it had been built on a lie. Her voice trembled as she spoke. So everything you told me was a lie? Was I just a project for you? A way to escape from your life? No, Ethan quickly responded, his voice desperate. No, I never saw you like that. What we had, it was real. You're real, but I couldn't tell you. I didn't want you to leave. Sophie stood up abruptly, backing away from the table. The weight of his words hit her all at once. The man she had trusted, the one who had stepped into her life, had been hiding his true identity all along. The connection she thought was built on honesty now felt tainted by secrets. I can't do this, Sophie said, her voice breaking as she turned to walk away. I need time to think. I need space. Ethan reached out for her, but she shook her head. No, don't follow me. I need to figure this out on my own. As she walked away, Sophie couldn't stop her mind from racing. The man she had started to care for, the one who had felt so different from the world of privilege she knew, had just shattered everything. The trust she had given him felt like a broken piece of glass, cutting through her heart. Sophie couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so lost. The conversation with Ethan had left her reeling, and for the rest of the day, she wandered through her shift at Brood Awakening in a fog. The words he had said echoed in her mind. The man she had come to trust, the one who had made her feel seen and heard, was part of a world she had never wanted to be a part of. It was as if the entire foundation of their relationship had crumbled, leaving her wondering if anything they shared was ever real. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on her customers and the tasks at hand. But it was impossible. Every glance toward the door, every customer who came in, seemed to bring her mind back to him. Sophie was angry, confused, and heartbroken all at once. She wanted to hate him for what he had done, for lying to her, but she couldn't shake the image of him sitting there, vulnerable and regretful. He had been honest in his feelings, but had he ever been truthful about who he really was? As the night dragged on, Sophie found herself alone in the break room, her apron hanging loosely from her shoulders. She stared at her phone, the screen displaying Ethan's messages, most of which she hadn't read. She hadn't been able to bring herself to look at them. Every word felt like another lie. But then, a text from James appeared, a name she hadn't expected. James was a business school friend of Ethan's, and in the few times Sophie had heard him mentioned, she never imagined he would reach out. She opened it, her fingers trembling as she read the message. Ethan quit the family business. He left everything behind. He's not the person you think he is. He's trying to find himself. Sophie blinked, trying to make sense of it. Ethan had walked away from it all? The empire, the money, the expectations? For the first time, Sophie considered the possibility that there was more to Ethan's story than she had seen. She had been so caught up in the lies, in the betrayal, that she hadn't stopped to understand why he had lied. Was it really about escaping? Or was it about finding something real? The next morning, after a restless night filled with too many unanswered questions, Sophie made a decision. She had to see Ethan again. She couldn't let her feelings be clouded by anger and assumptions. She needed closure, yes, but she also needed to understand who he was beyond the mistakes. She packed her bag and caught a bus to Pinewood Lodge. The place Ethan had started over. When she arrived, it wasn't the luxurious place she had imagined. It was small, rustic, and far from the world of wealth and opulence Ethan had once known. Sophie entered the lodge, her heart pounding as she saw him standing behind the reception desk. Looking so different from the man she had known before. No designer clothes, no carefully crafted image, just a man trying to make an honest living. Ethan looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though the space between them was filled with understanding, an understanding that, no matter how far they had come, they both had been searching for something real. I needed to see you, Sophie said, her voice steady, though her heart still raced. I needed to know if it was real. If you were real. Ethan nodded, his gaze sincere. I've never been more real than I am right now. I don't know what the future holds, Sophie, but I can promise you this, it's no longer about what I have. Or where I come from. It's about who I want to be. Sophie stood there, taking it all in. The anger, the confusion, the hurt, it was still there. But it was starting to fade. She didn't know what would happen between them. Maybe nothing would ever be the same again. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a small flicker of hope that people could change. That trust could be rebuilt. And that honesty might lead them to something better. As they walked outside together, the sun setting behind the lodge, Sophie realized that the journey she had been on wasn't about Ethan's lies or his family's wealth. It was about finding truth, not just in others, but in herself. And no matter what happened next, she knew one thing for sure. She had learned how important it was to keep her heart open to the possibility of second chances.